In August 1965, the New York Times reported that over a quarter of Americans already believed the Vietnam War could not be won, signaling early domestic doubt. The United States entered Vietnam aiming to halt communism as spread after France's 1954 defeat at Dien Bien, believing a loss would invite further insurgencies. By 1970, Gallup found 56% said the war damaged America's global prestige, while 71% condemned the draft as unfair among the populace. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence, establishing the Democratic Republic and beginning the nationalist struggle against French colonial rule. The Geneva Accords of 1954 temporarily split Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating separate communist and anti-communist zones pending elections that never occurred. North Vietnam fell under Ho Chi Minh's communist leadership, while the South was governed by US-backed President Nguyen, cementing a Cold War fault line. President Dwight D. Eisenhower promoted the domino theory in 1955, arguing that Vietnam's fall would trigger communist takeovers throughout Southeast Asia. In 1955, the United States dispatched a modest team of 900 military advisors to support President Dim's fledgling army in South Vietnam. By 1961, President John F. Kennedy raised the advisory contingent to over 16,000, emphasizing counterinsurgency training for the ARVN in South Vietnam's effort to contain the insurgency. National Security Action Memorandum 263, issued in 1963, outlined a phased withdrawal of American forces, a plan later upended by South Vietnam's political turmoil. The assassination of President Nguyen in November 1963 plunged Saigon into chaos, eliminating the USS initial South Vietnamese ally and reshaped us strategy. The Treasury Department funded Strategic Hamlet program aimed to isolate rural communities from Viet Cong influence by relocating villagers into fortified compounds across the South. In August 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox reported to separate attacks in the Gulf of Tonkin, providing the pretext for expanded US engagement. Congress responded with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Johnson near unlimited authority to use military force without a formal war declaration. By the end of 1964, the United States had authorized 23,000 troops in Vietnam, marking the shift from advisory to combat operations. On March 2, the first American combat battalions of Marines landed at Da Nang, officially commencing large-scale US ground involvement in the protracted conflict that would dominate the nation's conscience. Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965, launching a sustained bombing campaign over North Vietnam that would eventually drop more than 600,000 tons of ordnance. By 1966, American forces in Vietnam swelled to 385,000 soldiers, reflecting the rapid escalation of the war effort. During 1966, draft boards began issuing 100,000 call-ups each month, dramatically increasing the flow of young men onto the battlefields. In November 1967, US forces employed the new search and destroy doctrine at the Battle of Ia Drang, testing the air-ground coordination system for the first time. On January 30th, SIL 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive, striking more than 100 cities and outposts across South Vietnam, shocking the nation. On March 16th, SIL 1968, U.S. Army soldiers entered the hamlet of My Lai in Kinh Nguyen province, killing roughly 500 unarmed civilians in a brutal massacre. But by the end of 1968, American military presence peaked at 543,000 personnel, the largest deployment of US forces in any foreign conflict to date. In June 1968, CBS anchor Walter Cronkite declared the Vietnam War unwinnable, stating his personal belief that the United States ought to negotiate peace, influencing public opinion. During the August 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, thousands of protesters clashed with police, exposing the deepening domestic division over the Vietnam conflict. Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election, promising a policy of Vietnamization to transfer combat duties to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing US troops. In April 1970, U.S. forces crossed into Cambodia, targeting Viet Congé sanctuaries, prompting widespread anti-war demonstrations and expanding the war's geographic scope. On May 4th, SIL, 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on protesting students at Kent State University, killing 4 and injuring 9, intensifying campus anti-war sentiment. In June 1971, the New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers, revealing governmental deception about war progress and fueling further distrust among Americans. Later in 1971, Lieutenant William Calley was court-martialed and convicted for his role in the My Lai massacre, marking the first major war crime trial of the conflict. On January 27, SIL 1973, negotiators signed the Paris Peace Accords, setting a ceasefire and obligating the United States to withdraw its remaining combat troops. By March 1973, the last US combat units left Vietnam, leaving only a few thousand military advisors as the American war effort officially ended. On April 30th, SIL 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, marking the definitive end of the Vietnam War and the unification of the country under communist rule. After the war, over 1 million Vietnam veterans faced high unemployment and rising rates of PTSD, reshaping America's approach to veteran care. The war's controversy deepened public cynicism, culminating in the Watergate scandal, which further eroded confidence in government institutions during the early 1970s. On November 13, SIL 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C., offering a reflective stone wall honoring the lives lost and healed. When the 1991 Gulf War began, media and policymakers often cited Vietnam lessons, emphasizing swift objectives to avoid prolonged entanglement. In 1995, Congress passed a resolution awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to Vietnam veterans, acknowledging their service and the nation's overdue gratitude. The early 2000s saw a resurgence of Vietnam documentaries, using archival footage to educate new generations about the war's divisive legacy. The Vietnam era reshaped American identity, embedding skepticism toward foreign interventions and sparking enduring debates over patriotism, duty, and dissent.